Welcome to chapter 27. We are moving on now to the respiratory system. So a few different types to kind of highlight a little bit here. We are mainly just going to focus on the mammalian and the animal respiratory system, but just a little background. So just the definition, respiration is just the uptake of oxygen at the same time, simultaneous release of carbon dioxide. So we think about the primitive animal phyla, so just kind of getting to where we are today with our respiratory system. They obtained oxygen directly through their environment from diffusion. So their cells were thin enough, they didn't have, thick skin or anything like that. So oxygen was just able to freely diffuse from high to low concentrations into their cells, and then the carbon dioxide diffused out of their cells. Now, as phyla became more advanced, that's whenever the respiratory organs started to develop. Looking at gills, of course, in fish. So those gills allowed for respiration to occur in a specific place instead of just through all their cells. It was concentrated in those gill areas, and then ultimately developing the trachea and then into the lungs to allow that gas exchange to occur. So if we just look at some of the, again, different examples, so flatworms, for example, and this is, still how they go through respiration. Again, there's just simple diffusion across their cells. So oxygen's coming in, carbon dioxide is going out by simple diffusion. Then our fish, of course, have the gills. So within that gill filament it's called here, you can see it move down through here. Again, there are blood vessels that go along with that as well. And so the carbon dioxide is being released, oxygen is coming in as it moves across those gill filaments. Then just looking at kind of a simple trachea and what are referred to as tracheoles. So instead of having full lungs like we see in this arthropod here, like in the grasshopper, there's the trachea that is present, but there are no lungs. So the gas exchange of the oxygen and carbon dioxide occur there in those tracheoles. And then in mammals, of course, we have lungs. So the trachea brings the gases in or allows them to be exhaled. And then in the lungs is where we're going to get that gas exchange that actually happens in those regions called the alveoli. So again, focusing just primarily on the mammalian respiratory system. So of course, air passes in and out through the lungs, and those lungs are housed in the thoracic cavity. Air is warmed and filtered as it flows through the nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity is going to help kind of trap some debris, but it also warms the air before it gets to our lungs. So then it passes through the throat or the pharynx, then through the voice box or the larynx, then into the trachea, also commonly referred to as the windpipe. And then from there, that air is going to pass through branches called the bronchi, and then into smaller vessels referred to as bronchioles. So kind of similar to the circulatory system where we have the big arteries and they branch into the arterioles. We have the large trachea branches into the smaller bronchi, and then the bronchi branch further into bronchioles. That's just thinning the walls around them to allow for gas exchange, and that actually happens at air sacs called alveoli. So the lungs are filled with huge numbers of those alveoli, and that's exactly where the gas exchange occurs. So again, similar to the capillaries in our circulatory system. And so showing this, of course, the air is going to go through the nasal cavity. Let me switch colors here so we can see it. So it's going to go through the nasal cavity, helps warm it up, also helps get debris out. It's going to come down through the pharynx there at the throat, through the larynx, isn't labeled on here, and then down into the trachea. From the trachea, of course, it branches into both lungs, into the bronchioles, into the bronchi, and then the bronchi are going to branch into those smaller bronchioles, And then the bronchioles, as we look over here on the right, a little bit long, enlarged as the bronchioles as it comes down. Then we get these sacs called alveoli. And if we kind of peel them back, again, it looks very similar to capillaries that we saw in the circulatory system, but it's here in those alveoli that we actually have the gas exchange occurring. All right, so what kind of the parts then of the respiratory system? So this is referred to, kind of functions as a one-cycle pump. So the diaphragm, of course, is the muscle that separates that thoracic cavity where the lungs are from the abdominal cavity in our digestive system. Each lung has a thin membrane called the pleural membrane. So pleurisy, if you've ever heard of that condition, is where there's kind of an inflammation or infection in that membrane around the lungs. Makes it very hard to breathe, get oxygen, and exhale that waste. So again, that membrane, that pleural membrane, adheres to other pleural membranes in the lining of the thoracic cavity, essentially couples the lungs to the thoracic cavity. So it's not essentially glue, but it is kind of an adhesive that is going to attach those lungs to the cavity. So during a breathing action, of course, one breath is referred to as air coming in and out, makes up a complete breath. Air coming in, of course, is referred to as inhalation. So that's muscular contraction that causes the lungs and the chest to expand. Then exhalation is, of course, whenever the ribs and the diaphragm return. So again, we have contraction during inhalation, then relaxation. During exhalation, they return to their original position, and that expels the air from the lungs. All right, so again, just kind of this key process here. So again, during inhalation, that air pressure in the lungs is equal to the atmospheric pressure. So you see here the atmospheric pressure and the pressure in the lungs is going to be equal right before inhalation. So the diaphragm is nice and relaxed. Then during inhalation, so as we inhale, the diaphragm again is going to contract. As it contracts, that allows the lungs and the chest cavity to expand. And that also is going to indicate that the pressure inside of the lungs is less than the pressure on the outside of the lungs. And that's going to allow air to flow in. So then during exhalation, of course, as air is coming out, as the diaphragm relaxes and those lungs return to normal, then the pressure in the lungs becomes greater than the atmospheric pressure. So that allows or kind of forces the air out of the lungs. So the mechanics of breathing, so a few terms here. So tidal volume. So this is typically about half of a liter. So this is just the typical breath. So how much gas is coming in during a normal breath is referred to as the tidal volume. Any extra amount is referred to as the vital capacity. And that's actually about 4.5 liters in men and 3.5 or 3.1 in women. So our chest cavities are a little smaller in women. So that doesn't allow us to bring in as much total air as most men. But again, tidal volume is kind of a normal, typical breath. Vital capacity, though, is like the maximum. So if you're taking a deep breath in, that extra air coming in is referred to as the vital capacity. And then as we exhale, not all of the air is going to get released. So that little kind of remaining air is referred to as residual volume. So again, we exhale, but that doesn't completely remove all of the gas from our lungs. So what is left over is referred to as that residual volume. And just some ideas of numbers, it's about 1.2 liters. Now, I'm not going to ask you what these numbers are, but I do want you to understand the difference between, again, normal breath being the tidal volume, extra air that can come in, again, a deep breath is vital capacity, and then the air that remains in the lungs is referred to as residual volume. And that's even after you deeply exhale again, there's always some air left, and that is the residual. So how respiration works as far as gas exchange. So oxygen is carried by a protein called hemoglobin that's inside of our red blood cells, or those erythrocytes. Hemoglobin has iron attached to it, and iron, as you can see down here, has a positive charge. So the atomic symbol for it is Fe, but it has two positive charges associated. It's going to bind to oxygen in a reversible way. So it can attach, but it can also unattach. It's not a permanent connection between the iron and the oxygen. So the hemoglobin has multiple iron molecules on it, so that allows multiple oxygen molecules to attach to each hemoglobin. So that hemoglobin molecule is essentially like a little sponge for oxygen. So at high oxygen levels that occur in the blood supply, the lungs, most of it carries a full load of oxygen. So that, again, that's in the blood. Most of that hemoglobin has completely saturated with oxygen. Now in the tissues, the oxygen levels are going to be a lot lower. So again, hemoglobin there is going to give up its bound oxygen. Because again, diffusion means things are moving from a high concentration to low concentration. So in the blood, because hemoglobin is saturated, there's a lot of oxygen in the blood. Our tissues don't have a lot of oxygen. So that's going to allow the oxygen to move into our cells. And then if carbon dioxide is present, so if we've already went through metabolism and we need to get rid of that waste, then hemoglobin takes on a little different shape than what it normally does. And that even increases or allows oxygen to be given more readily. So it's not going to be stingy. If there's carbon dioxide present in that tissue or in that area, not only does it go from high concentration to low, but in the presence of carbon dioxide, it goes much faster, and that oxygen's given up from hemoglobin much more efficiently than it would be if carbon dioxide was not present. So then the carbon dioxide transport, again, it also is transported in the blood. About 8% dissolves in the plasma. Some of it attaches to the hemoglobin. So again, in the presence of carbon dioxide, hemoglobin dumps off its oxygen, picks up some of the carbon dioxide where the oxygen remained, and then some of it is going to diffuse into our red blood cells. So in order to keep that gradient for carbon dioxide so that it will leave the tissues and then enter the plasma, those carbon dioxide levels in the plasma have to be kept low. Because again, things move from a high to low concentration. So if the hemoglobin or the plasma had a lot of carbon dioxide already, then it can't pick up more from the tissues or from our cells. So that concentration in the blood is kept really low so that it can continue to pick up more and more. Now dealing with that, we have what's referred to as carbonic anhydrase. And ACEs usually indicate enzymes, which is the case here. So this enzyme, which enzymes are proteins, it combines with carbon dioxide and water, and it makes an acid called carbonic acid, which is H2CO3. That acid dissociates, just meaning it gives up its hydrogen, because again, there are two in that acid, so it donates one of its hydrogen, so it's called dissociating, and then what's left is a molecule called bicarbonate. So that other hydrogen is left with our CO3 there as well. So we have hydrogen ions and bicarbonate whenever the carbonic acid donates that hydrogen. Now the hydrogen ion that is released, it combined to that hemoglobin while in the red blood, and then that moves the bicarbonate out into the plasma. So the hydrogen ions attach to the hemoglobin, and then the bicarbonate goes into the plasma of our blood. So again, that protein moves the bicarbonate out and exchanges it for chloride. So we get a little exchange here, and this is referred to as chloride shift. So this reaction is very important to keeping that carbon dioxide level in the blood low, because remember, we need it to be low so that it flows out of our cells as waste from a high to low concentration. So as the blood is picking up this carbon dioxide, it gets converted into bicarbonate so that the overall concentration of CO2 is really low. So essentially, the bicarbonate keeps the carbon dioxide levels low, but it also acts as a buffer. So buffers control the pH. So bicarbonate is going to help keep the pH in our blood at a nice neutral pH. So then whenever we get to the lungs, the reverse reaction is going to take place. The carbon dioxide is going to be released from the bicarbonate, and then it can be exhaled from the lungs. So this is just showing, and I know this is pretty small here, but the figures in your book, and I encourage you to really look over it and understand, kind of what's happening here. So if we start, of course, here at number 1, so what we want to happen, so this is the alveoli of the lungs. Here, of course, is our red blood cell. So we want carbon dioxide to come out, and we want oxygen to come in. All right, so that oxygen in the lungs is going to attach to the hemoglobin in our red blood cells. So we pick up the oxygen. Then as we move through the body, again, now we have oxygen-rich blood. So that oxygen is then, whenever we get to our tissues, so we have our tissues here, that oxygen-rich blood, because there's more oxygen in the blood cell than there is in the tissue, the oxygen is going to come out. Now, that hemoglobin then can replace the oxygen with carbon dioxide. So then it can help drop off oxygen, pick up carbon dioxide. Now, once it's picked that up, we don't want to keep the carbon dioxide in the red blood cell, because then as the blood keeps moving, eventually that concentration's too high and it can't pick up anymore. So what happens is once that carbon dioxide, let me switch colors, once that carbon dioxide gets in the blood, it combines with water to make that carbonic acid. Okay, but then that carbonic acid can donate or dissociate that hydrogen ion and release bicarbonate. Okay, and then, as we just mentioned, we can get exchange, so the bicarbonate can come out and chloride can come in. So that allows the bicarbonate and essentially the carbon dioxide to be released from the cell. And then whenever that tissue drops it off and we go back to the lungs, now we're having oxygen poor blood. Now whenever it gets back to the lungs, we're going to get the reverse. So bicarbonate is going to go in to that red blood cell, chloride is going to come out. So the opposite of what we'd seen down here at number 4 in our tissues. Okay, so that bicarbonate comes in, it's going to make that carbonic acid, but then the carbonic acid is going to break down and release that CO2. And then that CO2 is going to be released into the alveoli and be exhaled. Okay, so again, it is important to understand how that oxygen is dropped off, but also a little bit more detailed process of how carbon dioxide gets released. It's not as simple as just picking up CO2 and releasing it. The CO2 is picked up by the blood, makes bicarbonate through carbonic acid, and then to exhale it, that bicarbonate is released, goes back to CO2, which ultimately gets exhaled. All right, so then we also have nitric oxide, another gas to mention here. So hemoglobin also can hold another gas called nitric oxide. So it can hold oxygen, it can hold carbon dioxide, and this nitric oxide. So nitric oxide, or NO, make sure you can differentiate between no, being told no, and then nitric oxide. But it has a big physiological role causing a lot of cells to actually change their shape and their function. One of the most notable functions of nitric oxide is in the blood vessels and relating to like heart attacks or cardiovascular health. So nitric oxide causes blood vessels to expand, or dilate, so it causes vasodilation because it relaxes the muscles around the blood vessels. So if somebody is thinking they're having a heart attack and they take nitroglycerin, nitroglycerin actually releases nitric oxide into the blood, and that causes the blood to dilate, to expand, causes the blood pressure to lower, and helps prevent or at least decrease a heart attack. All right, now kind of finishing up talking about the lungs, it's important to think about lung health and unfortunately the opposite, which would be in this case lung cancer that we're talking about. So this is actually one of the leading causes of death in adults, and all cancers are caused by mutations or changes in our DNA to genes related to cell division, so copying and making more cells. So in lung cancer, notably, there are two tumor suppressor genes that have been implicated in developing this cancer. So one is in a gene that makes a protein called RB, and that acts as a brake on cell division. So that's going to stop cell division. However, if it gets mutated, it's essentially releasing the brakes. So then those cells are able to keep dividing and dividing and dividing, and then that can lead to the tumor production. So in addition to the RB, another protein and another gene that is commonly mutated is called P53. In P53, this protein actually looks for damage or even foreign DNA, and if damaged DNA or mutated DNA is indicated, then it prevents that cell or that DNA from being replicated. Okay, so essentially what happens if both of these become mutated, now we don't have any brakes on cell division, and we don't kind of have that surveillance looking for mutations in DNA. So it allows those mutations to go undetected. And in addition to just lung cancer, the P53, about more than half of all cancers have a mutated or disabled P53 gene. So it's a very common mutation in cancers. Also, as we're well aware, smoking causes or has a strong link or correlation to lung cancer. So the annual incidence of lung cancer is much higher in smokers than non-smokers is one indication of that. Those changes in the incidence of lung cancer have mirrored the changes in smoking habits. So whenever smoking becomes more popular, the incidence of lung cancer goes up. As it becomes kind of taboo and decreases, then those incidences go down. So there are many types of mutagens, which are just chemicals that cause mutations. Doesn't mean they always will, but it increases the chances of causing mutations. So there are many different types of them found in cigarette smoking that can damage genes. And again, it could damage any genes, but the ones related to cancer are the ones like the P53. Again, about 70% of lung cancers have that damaged P53. And then once you kind of lose that surveillance of looking for mutated DNA, it just allows more mutations to occur. So again, smoking also leads to that nicotine addiction. Nicotine is one of the most addictive drugs that's out there, even more so than like cocaine or something. It is highly addictive. So that, of course, increases the amount of smoking, increases the exposure to mutagens, which increases one's chances of developing lung cancer. And this is just kind of showing kind of the incidence in the United States as far as you can see, especially up in the northeastern part of the United States, higher cancer levels are indicated there. But again, just kind of looking overall at some of the numbers. And then this is looking at the incidence of lung cancer in men and women. So in males and females, so males are actually more likely to consume cigarettes, and therefore they are more prone, or it's more likely to, or has a higher incidence in males and females. But again, both both are affected the same way by these mutagens. It just, for whatever reason, seems that males are more likely to smoke, so therefore they are more likely to develop lung cancer. All right, and that wraps up this chapter on the respiratory system.